Like, see, I'm like, dude, I can't get down like that. I can't get down like that. I'm too cute for prison. And they're fighting every day. So much fun. You can get right. Yeah. You got
So it's a greenhouse, but it's completely chemical. So it's coming like 3 times a day. It's going to be 75 years.
Yeah, I can. Let's go through here.
Seems pretty straightforward, right?
Hey, Lawrence, I need a box and a
I mean, I've done it. You know, it's right. I got real houses. All businesses work in some kind of way. This right here is everybody thinks they know everything about this stuff. 90% of people don't know shit. Just to be real.
But if you want to grow and you're helping you with like food, I mean, you're in trouble. They don't want to and I'm like, oh, what about? They didn't ask
I got a guy that was growing. In the lights just right on fire. Somebody sold us their major lighting system. And he's got this shit that he told I don't know what you're trying to do. You're trying to order yourself. Those are never going to grow. You got to make something. This guy, you can. I don't think you know what you're talking about. I just only been in about, I don't know, 1,000 grows here in the last year. We've only tested about, I can tell you, somebody told you will build, you're going to have mold and you have I can't grow hydroponic unless you try to grow
We're leaning towards living soil. Build a whole separate infrastructure for the nutrients and bring in mediums every single time. You just put it all together at once, right? That's all I yeah, because we have such surrounding weather.
You got to have a broken system around your field. And what's crazy about cannabis is the smoking the hardest, the most resilient plant on the planet, but still, yeah, very, very sensitive. Very, very. I'm talking one of the things. If you want to go out and bring them stuff to get them, you can introduce alcohol to the roots, and it'll take that in and pop it. And some of those guys are parts of the building. We had a guy who had a big fruit tail test because they popped the right. I smoked alcohol. You haven't got it? So they're all pissed off. They're like, it never science ain't what the science is. It's not going to show up unless it's there. So you got guys who go to alcohol, and they're like, well, that's bullshit. So then I get what's going on. And then you got to go back and say, there was a girl that was hired to clean out some of the alcohol.
Do they still test like this for recreational weed in the States? What about like tobacco? Do they go through that shit like testing? Right. So that's me like.
That's what wrong with it. They sold all their shit.
That's why
Cigarettes are a whole different ball. They have to. Which shit is that?
Yeah, it makes sense to test like this if you're doing it medically, right? But if it's like recreational, right? Exactly. Makes sense. If it's recreational, they're doing it recreationally. It makes sense. They're still doing it.
Oklahoma, I guarantee will still do California is different. Because like Colorado, Oklahoma, I would spend money. They're going to keep the same path as recreation. Same thing. Like soda? What kind of And what is your husband to do? That's right. Good. Hey, mine are grown. 24, 27. Which I love. I love getting that. I would buy it if he does. You've been real. Amen. Amen.
There for a little while. I mean, Mike kind of together for
Oh, shit.
yeah, just not married, but you know, on the first, I was like in the 30s, and then by the 35,
That's what I was. And I love being a man. As soon as we got our second, and I was in church, she got blessed this right now. And I was on my way out. She was as I was done. I said, I'm probably not kids to this world. Oh, this is
so it's every third Thursday. And then next door is the building. And that's their office. There's a different office down there. I have a lot of meetings here.
That was really nice that I want that I don't hey, they really fucked me up about that.
And it really this 14%. That's how much your people
I gotta get that. I gotta get so I've got people carrying it out. I mean, all these markets for out of now, all these I'm gonna make it work nice and comfortable that I can say, live here with their brother. I'm gonna do that. But I'm y'all need to. And then so I met Travis. But everybody down there and fun. They just trying to get me to buy a place down there. So I finally paid. But it's gonna be good. Anytime I'm coming on have a place to take the juice, I'm gonna go down there, I'm gonna have lots of y'all can see a lot. Everybody, they're super cool. Y'all me and Mark were talking about that yesterday. You came over to my house. Remember when Mark had traveled to my house last night? Hanging out my it's gonna be fun. So they just trying to get me over there forever, so I'll finally legit. Oh, when I went down there and left this place, and I was saying, Mark is trying to race me in. I said, I'm fucking I just used to go down there. And matter of fact, Mark and I, he's got a boat now. Some people at my house every 3 days. And I think we're going to sell both of them. I'd love to get what we're going to put together by a really, really nice, like a big, nice. I think that I've got to see how they yeah, there's a bunch of them. Matter of fact, my buddy Chuck, who runs the bar there, that we were all going to help him, and everybody, yeah. But he's got a 34-foot big lunch and so, you know, like, so I didn't Sunday, I had to put shit from Sunday, like all of us, you know, early food. They bring you pay 30 people in that food. Something go by the party hall. That's a big deal. All around. It's a yacht. It's considered, I mean, that's like a mini yacht. But it's considered a yacht. I think it's still about all the time. It's a yacht. You go around.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun.
That was good, buddy. Super chill. Yeah. So we're gonna get it to where it's gonna be cool. I'm gonna make my little spot really my trailer's 2-bedroom, 2-bath. Yeah. And I'm gonna make the living room. I'm gonna open everything up, make it real wild. Right. Tracy and that's gonna be pretty right. Yeah, it's gonna be bad.
No way.
Oh my God.
It's all good. Yeah, pretty much. Oh, yeah, that works for me. I appreciate you coming. I appreciate you out here. Everybody here together. I'll try to work together right now. Instead of being a thousand or like I get anywhere, there's road block. So we started a road block.
I'm going to do it. So we can find together. I'm all over that. I've got a lot of connections to the rest.
Good evening, everybody. Check, 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 check. Everyone in the back, thank you. Thanks for coming out tonight to our Oklahoma Cannabis Industry Association's Policy and Pints This is our second year doing this. We host them every Thursday, so for those of you that are, or excuse me, the third Thursday of every month. So those of you that are new, welcome. I'm Bud Scott, Executive Director of OCIA. Also, okay, so point of order here. Everyone, if you're not on stage or sitting down at the table, you need to wear your mask when you're walking around. That's actually by city ordinance. So make sure and put that mask up. What's that commercial they're running? Mask up, basically. So go ahead and try that. And but we need to make sure we're not spreading any virus, and management wants to make sure we're all doing our part. So again, thank you guys. Bud Scott, one of Cannabis Industry Association Executive Director. Tonight we're going to go over several policy changes that have occurred just recently, and then also some proposed rules as well. So we've got quite a bit to go over. Need to make a few announcements. Tonight we're actually kind of giving a shout out to one of our newest members, which is Indoor Sun Garden Supplies, located over on I-40 in Meridian. Go check them out. They're new members. You need your soils, you need your nutrients. And we've got our Maria and Lauren Catchable? Rachel Catchable, thank you. Back here in the side room. So anyone who wants to talk about supply issues after the meeting, check them out next time and get you guys connected. So we'd like to make an announcement here and have all of our board members that are on hand go ahead and get recognized. We just had Ms. Cambry White, who is our vice chairman, vice chairwoman with Overland Legal Group and Time Collective. Let's see, Blake Cantrell with the PWC, we got Blake right there. Blake is our chairman. Let's see, Julie Tarocco with Green Laboratories, right here in the middle, up there in southern Logan County. Joanna Hamrick with the Urban Canopy here in Oklahoma City. She sells seeds. She's up at check-in. She also offices next door to her headquarters. Lawrence Cagigan with Greenboro CPAs. Where's Mr. Lawrence at? There he is, Lawrence Cagigan, ladies and gentlemen. He's our official rush chair for the OCIA. Dan good man. He also offices next door with us. Am I missing any other board members here? No, we got Cambry. Not sure other board members are here tonight. Just for those of you that might be interested, Honey Creek Laboratories, they're up in Grove and Tulsa. Andy Stewart is on our board as well. We've got Ronnie Jaoud with Astoria Growers up in Tulsa. We've got Joseph Lance with Genesis Testing. They're up in Grove and Tulsa as well. James Vandersea, who's with ETI, Environmental Testing Incorporated, which is also Cannabis Laboratories. They're about a mile away here in Santa Fe. And let's see, Joey Mybergen, who's with Primal Cannabis up in Enid. The guy has a monstrously large operation. So if anyone's interested in checking it out, I actually recommend getting in touch with them. It's a hell of a facility. So, am I missing anyone else tonight? Let me give a shout out to Caleb Walmart, who is basically our membership manager. He runs the ship here at OCIA. Those of y'all probably met him at check-in or you've checked in with him before with membership issues. Please give him a hand up because he really keeps the ship afloat. Okay, before I move forward on talking about policy issues, does anyone have any announcements they want to make? Feel free, it's an open floor. Mike Cantrell with the Peak is actually going to make an announcement out with the meeting about some product issues. I want to point out the gentleman over here, Pure Buds USA. We met earlier today, and I'm pretty excited about their services. They're using the radio frequency devices for treating yeast, mold, other contaminants. They're here in Oklahoma City. Highly recommend speaking with them. From all the research that I've done, it's actually one of the safest and least impactful on your cannabis product processes of remediation. So he's over here in the corner. Stand up with your hands, people know. Thank you. Okay, so tonight we've got a few things going here. You may have received an email last Friday notifying you that there were new criminal rules going into effect. Those were the rules that have actually been developed over the course of the last year. So they've been approved by the agency. I think we worked on those last January, December, November, and those were approved by the legislature by bulk action during the 2020 legislative session, and then signed off by the governor shortly thereafter. So those just went into effect last Friday. Now, at the same time, we've been having meetings with what's basically the administrative body for the OMA. It's called the Food Safety Standards Board, or the Oklahoma Medical Marijuana Advisory Board. At these board meetings, we've been already discussing emergency proposed rules, which are going to effect immediately, and then new proposed permanent rules. So a whole new round of modifications on top of what's just going into place. So there's a lot of changes that have occurred, and there's a lot more on the agenda. So we're trying to keep track of it. Honestly, it's way too much to go over in one meeting, so I'm not going to stand up here and go over every single rule. You should have received an email this morning which highlighted the proposed summary of changes. So both from the current rules that just went into place, and then the proposed emergency rules, and the proposed permanent rules that will likely go into place in 2021. So you should have gotten that already. It's extensive. I'm holding them right here. We're going to go over a few of those points, and then we'll discuss our activities that have occurred at the Food Safety Standards Board last Monday and then also last month. So before we get started on this, does anyone have any questions? No questions. That's not normal.
Yeah, there should be a lot. I have questions, but I've been reading shit all week.
All right, that'll work. So for those of you who don't know, I was appointed to what's called the Food Safety Standards Board in August of 2018 by then Commissioner Tom Bates. It's an advisory body for the OMA for the rulemakings. That's what basically regulates our industry. And I have the pleasure of serving on that alongside 9 agency appointees and then 2 other private sector folks. So it's 3 and 9 of agency. And honestly, it's a fantastic body. We've been able to prevent some pretty onerous and negative rules from going into place that were proposed by the agency. And then we've also proposed and educated the other agencies on how cannabis works, on how the industry's developed. So it's been a really positive body to be a part of. However, it is literally kind of the only public input that the agency receives. So it's incredibly important that people participate, that they comment whenever we have rulemakings proposed, and that you really are part of the process. So, and just understand that I'm there for you guys. That's why I serve on that board, is to provide a voice. If you have input, if you have recommendations, if you have questions, feel free to email me. That's what you do as a member of the OMA, or excuse me, the OCIA. You're probably members of the OMA too. As members of the OCIA, as memberships there, basically I take my marching orders from you guys. So I know that our other board members would be more than happy to hear from you as well. Those are processors, there's growers, dispensary owners, and laboratories. So if you have something specific on those areas, I would definitely reach out to some of them and share your thoughts, because it'll all come back to us and we'll talk about it at board meetings anyways. So thank you guys. On a different note, I'm a little rugged today. Some of y'all have seen me the last few months looking a little rugged. It's outdoor harvest time, so I operate a farm out in Okima, 400 acres of beautiful wilderness and lots of animals, cannabis, and produce. So if I'm looking less professional than usual, that's my justification for it. So tonight we're going to go over several things. One is the permanent rules that you got that email about. There were several programmatic changes that addressed. I think some of the most important that are included in that are provisions allowing for product remediation. And basically that set forth the first standards for remediation. And then now in the additional rule changes, they're trying to refine that program a bit. So that's going to be one of your biggest changes. There's some serious sections dealing with testing protocols, how you handle samples, how you do training for handling sampling, how you report this. Basically, it's all setting forth the process that we have to take for ensuring chain of custody, for having documentation of this, both for your vendors and then also for the agency itself. So there's substantial changes there. these are all very positive, I think, for the public health, but they're also quite a bit different than what we've been dealing with. So I'm going to jump into a few of those changes right now. Okay. There we go. All right, so some of the biggest ones that I actually saw that we participated in were fairly, there was a lot of dialogue at the advisory boards in this, a lot of arguments in certain areas. We had to really educate the OMA staff because they're still really learning about how we do business, how processes work, how equipment works. So when they propose rules, oftentimes they have good intentions, but they really don't understand the ramifications of these proposals. So we do our best to really try to educate them on this, and are very fortunate to have some really willing and listening ears. So first thing that you might find different in the new rules, if you're getting ready to reapply for your new license or for license renewal, now you're going to have to demonstrate what's called indirect beneficial owners. So it's not just your ownership. Say you're an LLC, you've got 5 owners that are part of that membership. You can typically just list them on your license application. And now, if your landlord, for example, collects any percentage of revenue or kickback, any salespeople that might receive kickbacks, any potential lender or creditor, anyone who's receiving funds from the company as part of their remuneration, the repayment, that's going to be considered an indirect beneficial owner. And you'll have to report that here pretty quick. So this is a pretty big new change, but what it's intended to do is shield true ownership, because up until this point, it's been pretty much like a Mack truck. You got a whole hole you can drive a Mack truck through. Yeah, you can try to report who the actual owners of the company are, but you didn't even have to submit corporate documents. So now, obviously, it's required that you submit your operating agreements, so you submit all of your articles of organization, anything documenting that real ownership, and that's extending beyond just on paper. So if you haven't spoken with your legal counsel about this issue, highly recommend that you do. We have several great attorneys that are members of this association, including Ms. Cambry White and Mr. Chris Cotner is over here in the other room. They really can give you some good counsel and direction as we go over some of these new projects, these new proposed rules. So that's one of the biggest things as indirect beneficial owners. We're seeing a lot of changes, mainly, like I said, on testing and on remediation. The remediation issue is something we battled about for 3 or 4 different meetings at the advisory board. We had a 7-hour meeting one night where we drafted up language at the board meeting that would have proposed or would have allowed the folks to go through what's called process valuation or validation. That's basically where, instead of submitting test every 10 pounds for your harvest batch, that you're setting up a process that every month for the first 3 months you submit tests that demonstrate you're using the same protocols, you're using the same variables, but as soon as you change them, you have to actually have new tests put in place. So with the process validation, as long as you don't change it, you're set after a certain period, and then you actually don't have to test it anymore until you change your product. That's typically how most of the other industries do this. So it's a big positive step in the right direction that we're loosening up on testing, but this is something that we've been fighting for extensively at the agency for the last 9 months at least. So there's some big positive changes there. We're not going to go deep into the testing standards. One of the things that I think someone asked me at our last meeting, one of the things I'm most proud of doing work in this industry and advocating for the industry, and especially in service on this advisory board, is the fight to address the yeast and mold testing. And for those of you that are growers, I'm not sure if you realize, but before, everyone should have been failing tests on yeast because they required you to test for any kind of yeast. There's 50,000 different types of yeast that are out there. There's about 5 different types of yeast that have been demonstrated to be harmful to human health. So we were requiring tests, and you could be failed for a test that showed any of those different types of yeast. On your hand at any one time, there's probably 50 different types of yeast, and none of them are harmful. And according to the previous rules, had you shown anything above 10,000 colony forming units, then you would have failed that test and you would have been incapable or prohibited by law from selling that product. So we were to change that issue, and now yeast testing is restricted to a certain, there's about 5 different types of yeast, and so you only have to test for those and only for certain products where those are found the most. So for flour, for example, yeast really isn't an issue anymore, which is a good thing. But we still have mold issues, but we were able to get the standards reformed and basically decreased, which I think was a hell of a deal. Saved a lot of growers a lot of money. So, thank you.
Hey, Bud, I think there's a question back here.
Yes.
Something that you just covered. When
does the indirect beneficial ownership rules go into effect?
They're in effect now.
Okay.
They went into effect last Friday. So anyone who's getting ready to resubmit, they're getting ready to change all of the program requirements for what you send in through your Complia database. It's no longer just going to be your operating agreement. So get ready. Okay, one of the other issues is on the sampling protocols. We had to work they wanted to implement some pretty draconian testing requirements. First, they were going to require that the laboratories come out and collect samples. I'm not sure how that would have worked for all your guys' businesses, but it seriously would have required labs for every test to come to you and do that process, which would cost an extensive amount of money. How many of you guys or businesses are located in the Oklahoma County metro area?
Whoop, whoop.
Quite a few. Quite a few. How many are outside of the metro? All right, so we've got a handful here from outside the metro. All of you guys, that would cost quite a bit. I mean, unless you have a laboratory tucked away north of Guthrie or somewhere out in Tonkawa, then it costs quite a bit for them to come and actually pick up those samples. So there's a couple of services that were already offering that. A Steep Hill, they're over in the eastern part of the state, they were offering pickup service already, but we were able to actually prevent that from happening, and we're able to get some common sense sampling requirements put into place.
We got another question from one of our members watching the stream.
Sure.
They'd love to know more about the process validation rules and how to document that and meet the new testing requirements.
So the process validation hasn't been spelled out completely. It's been more of a general discussion. Right now, all of your testing protocols are still going to remain as they are because they have not spelled out process validation. And it's pretty extensive and it's step-by-step, both in the permanent rules as they are. They're posted right now on oma.ok.gov. But again, we're about to see even further changes to those. So there's quite a few things about how testing works, but process validation, it's really not a very complicated issue once it's in place, but they have not set the specific standards for that. There's some arguments from their legal division that they're restricted from actually fully implementing that program until the statute has been changed that requires that 10-pound harvest batch. So they're still kind of finagling it on their end. However, the current testing protocol is still in that 10-pound requirement. We've just seen a lot of clarification and also a lot of new requirements. So I hope that answers your question. I know I wasn't able to go too deep into process validation, but I can explain it really quickly, which is basically instead of having to test for every 10 pounds, not a single industry in the country, if we're talking about agricultural products, hay, wheat, corn, eggs, pharmaceuticals, alcohol, nothing is required to have such extensive testing on such a small basis. So there's no public health requirement behind it. Unfortunately, the agency's hands are kind of tied on this issue because this is in statute, and statutes govern the agencies. The agencies adopt regulations. The regulations are subject to those statutes. So in statute, it says 10 pounds. So they got to do it for every 10 pounds. However, with process validation, you would do a test for a predetermined cycle, typically about 2 to 3 months or 2 to 3 cycles on a specific product. You take your samples, submit them for testing, and so long as you've demonstrated that you have a good quality product, there's no external variables impacting. So for example, if I'm doing my grow and I'm growing Bubba Kush, and I'm doing Bubba Kush for 2 cycles, I'm using the same nutrient cycle each time, I'm using the same types of soils, then that means my process hasn't changed, and then it becomes validated. Now, if I decide to change my nutrients and add 3 or 4 different blends, I'm gonna have to reset my process validation, and then I would have to do testing again. So that's typically how that works. Is that a thorough explanation?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Question.
Yes, sir.
Laboratories
Yes.
collecting samples. Is it, or is it not, would it be compliant? Let's say that a laboratory in Oklahoma City set up a collection point in Bonita, Oklahoma, and they had a business there where they put a drop safe. And put a grower with a pre-provided envelope. Put the sample, the paperwork in there, drop it in the drop safe, have a transporter pick up that, the contents of that safe and bring it back to the lab. I'm getting multiple readings of this.
So first, I think it depends on the standard operating procedures that the lab has adopted. And this is an issue that is both in the current permanent rules and then the new proposed emergency and new proposed permanent rules as well. Talking about how sampling works. And a lot of this is to the deference they defer to the laboratory, and the laboratory, whatever their standard operating procedures say for their sampling protocol, which typically, like if you use environmental labs that do water collection or do soil samples, they'll have a chain of custody protocol. It's just a form that says who actually collected the sample, what time, where, when it was transported, who had that, who delivered it, then who signs for it at that laboratory. Standard chain of custody protocol, and that's going to be required here. Would it be allowed to have a third-party transporter take that product from a drop box to the laboratory facility? I'm not sure why not.
Okay, so in the chain of custody, could that be, in your opinion, could that be dropped in a, let's say, a drop safe?
Yeah.
Where nobody has access to it. It's unattended for a matter of hours. You know, you say the grower, it has to be dropped off by 10 a.m. on Thursday.
Yeah.
And then the transporter comes to it at noon, collects the entire contents, puts it in a tote, and takes it to the lab.
You know, I don't have enough information to be able to make a formal legal analysis on it. But to me, it seems like as long as the integrity of the sample could be preserved, then I'm not sure why that would be an issue. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You do that.
So we already did that.
There you go.
As long as they get filled out the chain of custody, there's really not a difference, you know, than me going directly to the lab, going to the processor and having to fill out the chain of custody, sign it.
Well, we just finished putting together a collection program with a lab, and we're going to do the pickups. But in another lab who I work with has told me, oh no, you can't do that. So that's why I'm like,
I
why
don't know why
not?
you can. I mean, as long as the chain of custody is in there and they just signed it, then you're gonna be picking it up and you're gonna take it to the lab and the lab's gonna sign off and you're gonna sign it. So your chain of custody is covered, which is what your lab needs to have to be legal. And, you know, so as long as that's done, that's all that's needed.
So for those of you listening from home or in the other room, our representatives from Full Med Labs, you guys are in Oklahoma City, and they're an admin, they do 100% pickup statewide. They're explaining that yes, that's totally allowed. What the question was about, that you can do drop-off service, and so long as that chain of custody protocol is followed and preserved, then there should be no issues with it. So thanks for making me not have to make a legal opinion on that. So another question, yes, sir. Yeah, I'll do my best. So the question is, how does the 10-pound production batch definition go into different products? There has been little to no formal guidance and opinions issued by the OMMA on this. Typically, it's been directly per issue. So they're more than happy to talk to you about your specific item. Would you agree? But more than happy to look at your specific item with a specific company, but they had issued no formal guidance on how the 10-pound production batch works for every product. So is that just the straight distillate that comes in? Is it the carton at the end use? Personally, I think it's probably at the end use. You just have to submit that product for testing, and typically they're going to be able to find any of the issues that they're testing for. So with carts, for example, you have sometimes the potential for heavy metal contamination because of the canister that's holding it or the mechanism. So that's the reason why they're going to want the entire end use on it, to make sure they can pick up those heavy metals or any other compounds that might still be there that may not have showed up with just the raw product. So if you're doing the concentrate and then putting it into edibles, if you're processing the concentrate and then putting it in the edible is the product that you're sending out. So you would test the edible at that point. So does that answer your question? And every 10 pounds, yeah, very light edibles, exactly. Thank you, Austin. Yes, sir. Henry.
Yeah. Give her the mic.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Asking me to do a lot here. So we had a client that asked the same exact question. What we had to do is do a full panel test on the distillate, and then after it's infused into the edibles, you only have to test for THC potency and microbials. Yes. So you don't have to do 2 full panels. So you do full panel on the distillate and then just microbials. They have not stated that. You're correct. 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 Yes. Correct. I'll try.
Bud, can you summarize?
What was she saying correct to?
Exactly. So when she was talking about the cost of edibles and the impact this will be on the third or the next finished product, and I've actually had the opposite where we're testing. If you ran the distillates and then you're putting it in your own product, you're not actually selling that distillate. You can have that whole thing full panel tested. But if she received direct guidance on that as well from the LMA, that was the opposite. And this is not uncommon, by the way, for us to get very conflicting opinions. So does that answer your question? Absolutely. The process validation is why we need that, yes. The comment is about, so for example, if you're selling infused pretzels, and it's 1 pretzel per bag, and it's 1 pound. Well, 10 pounds, 10 pretzels, you're going to be running a full panel test on, and that's pretty excessive. It's exactly why you need process validation, because again, no other industry or product is tested this rigorously. So those are some of the biggest issues are testing. Process validation, again, we still have to work out the details on, but it's been authorized and we have language now in statute for this. Sure, question, Chris? Okay. I'm going to run through a couple other things.
Right. Can we keep it down a little bit? We got people trying to listen. Not trying to be an asshole. But.
All right, everyone. Obviously, anyone dealing with waste disposal issues now, there's been some clarification on how waste disposal will operate, what's required, who can actually operate those licenses. Do we have any waste disposal licensees here? No. I think we have several in the organization. Like, do you have one?
We've got 4.
We have 4. Okay. Well, there's new provisions there. If you're doing waste disposal, you're mandated now to use one of these waste disposal companies. So if you're a processor and you have spent byproduct, you have anything that's expired, anything that could be potentially contaminated or recalled, you must use a third-party waste contractor. Yes, ma'am. Okay, so the question was, does this apply to growers as well? So during the 2019 legislative session, this piece of legislation was adopted that created the waste management licenses. And in the definitions section of the legislation, there are efforts we were able to exclude from the definition root balls, stems, stalks, seeds, and fan leaves from that definition. So we are not, as growers, required to dispose of that through a third-party waste management licensee. However, we can do on-site disposal. You can do composting. You can literally just till back into the ground. You can do some incineration in certain areas, and the DEQ may not want you to do it at all, but we all have country living as. But if you're in a city, you always have to check with your local ordinances and make sure they allow for any kind of burn. What I recommend, because this is going to come in rules anyways, is, excuse me, see my feedback reduces right here. So what we're about to see in the proposed rules, the agency is wanting to require us, even after we got the statute, to exclude all of those plant matters from waste as a definition. The agency now wants us to report our non-waste plant material. So it's exactly what we prohibited in legislation, but they're trying to do the regulations. They're going to push it through in the new proposed permanent rules, and it's also included in the emergency rules that they're submitting to the governor tomorrow. So this is something we will have to start doing. We had extensive dialogue at the advisory board on this issue. I did my best not to throw a complete fit, but was pretty upset about it because it contradicts the direct intent of the legislation governing this, and it's really burdensome. So they came to a compromise, in their opinion, and basically they're just going to require us as growers to maintain a log, and on that log it's going to say as simple as employee A was out in field B today picking fan leaves, disposed of them in compost bin B. So instead of what they were initially requiring or wanting to require, which would have been weighing them, counting them, holding them in storage, we got them to come down to this where we can literally do an Excel spreadsheet and do basic documentation. And the reasoning behind this is the fear of diversion of these products. I know there's not a thriving market right now for root balls, but someone very well may find a need for it at some time or an ability to do some serious extraction from it. So it could become an issue. I feel like since we were able to negate the attempt to make us weigh it and count them, I know I couldn't do that. You start doing outdoor cultivation, and you're talking about extensive acreage, and these are agricultural operations, not small craft grows. So at that point, really had to educate them on how burdensome that would be for us, and how really it's not like any other industry. If you're raising wheat, typically whatever's done at the end of the year, you're going to plow down into the soil. Same thing with corn. You don't go and count literally every single plant, and now we no longer have to do that. So we will, though, have to do a little log. It's not a waste disposal log, it's a non-plant waste, or excuse me, non-waste plant matter log. So that's something that will start being required as soon as these emergency rules are adopted, which again will probably be sometime next week, maybe the week afterwards. So with all the rule changes that are permanent, again, it's a little confusing right now. I had to explain to my board, and honestly, I had to get clarification from the agency at our last meeting. We entered into a proposed emergency rulemaking. For those of you that aren't agency dorks like I am, and who really enjoy regulatory development, it can be a little cumbersome, a little complicated at times. But what an emergency rule is, that means that there's something that is such a public health and safety issue that requires an agency to adopt a rule, a regulation, without going through the typical public participation process. And in Oklahoma, what's called permanent rules is governed by the Oklahoma Administrative Procedures Act, and it requires that an agency publish a rule, its rules at the Secretary of State, and then do 30 days of public comment, and everyone can submit comments and their thoughts. And then there's an actual hearing where they go through the agency adoption process. Then it goes to the legislature for approval, and the governor has to sign off on it. So you have your permanent rulemaking, which goes through that whole process and also ensures public transparency. And then you have your emergency process, which doesn't require any of that. And it's the agency pushing a rule, they adopt it, the governor signs off on it, it becomes law immediately. But it actually expires though, if it's not acted on by the end of the next legislative session, which would be next June. So we have proposed emergency rules that we met, let's see, in August for the advisory board, reviewed those rule proposals, made several recommendations that came from our board, from the OCIA and the advisory board there. They made their changes to it and then sent out the document to us last Friday night for our meeting on Monday, which includes the proposed emergency rules and the proposed permanent rules. Is that clear as mud, guys? Does everyone get it?
Agency door here.
Yeah. Anyone have any questions on that? I mean,
Now's the time.
yeah, now's the time. So basically, we're going to have a new set of rules that were emailed to you this morning. They're underlined in black in that document that was sent to you. And then the permanent rule proposals are in red. So I highly recommend that you look at these because they are going to impact your business. You think about those issues, and if you have additional questions, then send those out. Because I'm not sure many people probably got to read it today.
Yeah, it's 110 pages.
Yeah, 110 pages, and it's quite a dive of easy reading. So want to make sure that you get an opportunity to go over those and then submit any comments you have to us. We'll be going over this, I'm sure, for the next few months. Yes.
So the email that you referenced came from OMMA?
Yep.
Okay, and supposedly went out to all of the licensees? Yeah, about that.
Well, hey, all of the same things I sent out to every one of you that are members this morning.
Okay, I saw your email. But
Yeah, that's the same thing. He's referencing the same thing.
Okay, because I didn't get anything from OMMA.
OMA sent out an email last Friday, and it said, new emergency rules go into effect today. And then about an hour later, they sent out a different email saying new permanent rules, because it was not emergency rules. These were the permanent rules that were approved by the legislature and the governor earlier this year.
Okay.
So, and we've discussed these at several of our Policy of Pints events over the last 6 months, the new permanent rules that are in place. So I'm going to kind of jump in a little bit to some of the action that happened at this week's meeting, which was really fun. We had a few people that participated. Julie Tarocco, you were on the call. You know, all these meetings are held by Cisco WebEx now, so it's not in person. But it's actually nice because you can chime in. You can actually watch the entire event. You can listen. And unfortunately, when it's non-COVID and we have to meet in person, we host our meetings up in the health department, which is the kind of blender building on 10th, just east of Lincoln. So, and it's a very small room. There's never anyone there except for the board members, maybe a couple people from the media. So this is a really nice format that people have the opportunity to participate and really watch what's going on. The OMA is supposed to be posting those meetings on their website. Did you watch me live, or was it? Okay. Okay. It was 3 hours. Yeah, the meeting last month was 3 hours. The meeting on Monday was about 3 hours as well. But they're supposed to post those, so you should be able to go. They're not up yet. I know they weren't up last night. Julie?
So on the rules that went into effect last Friday, is there any opportunity for us to change those rules?
So kind of. The question is, the rules that went into effect last Friday, are there opportunities to change those rules? Well, yes, rules can always be changed. It's just the timeliness and how that process works is what's the issue. So the permanent rules that went into effect Friday, well, the emergency proposed rules that are being sent to the governor Friday, those are changing them right there. And then these new proposed permanent rules, the changes to the ones that just went into place, that's what's going to be submitted for public comment starting in October. So yes, we'll have the opportunity to continue communicating with the agency, with their personnel on these issues, and attempt to change their draft of these proposed permanent rules. The public comment process should start about the second week of October. There will be 30 days at that point, And I highly recommend that we will be working as an organization to have formal comments that we provide to any of you as basically talking points that you can submit to their website, and those will be compiled at the agency and can help influence how these rules are developed. So yes, there's plenty of opportunity to change those permanent rules, but the permanent rule proposal process, excuse me, the 4 Ps as we call it, those basically will start in October, but they wouldn't even go into place until 2021. So
And on the rules that went into effect, is there any grace period for people to make that happen?
no is the short answer on that. Just to be honest, the question was, is there any grace period for implementation or compliance with the permanent rules that went into effect Friday? And no, those are now the permanent rules that we all have to comply with. However, I think you'll find that the OMA staff is still going to be very flexible, especially on, say, packaging. Because there are a lot of labeling requirement changes that were made over the last year. There's still some new proposed labeling changes. So if you had 10,000 units of boxes made and shipped here, you'd want to get those products out as quick as possible, or get ready to pull them and put up new packaging with all the new requirements. Do you have any other questions? Shoot them up here, guys. Come on. Okay. So the summary of the proposed emergency changes. This is where we're really jumping into further defining how remediation and decontamination works. They're setting up 2 programs. Remediation is effectively for processed items, and decontamination is for flour. They each have their own processes. It's fairly extensive on here. Most of it has to do with how retesting and testing will be handled. But up until this point, I'm not sure everyone realized, but we weren't technically allowed for a long time to do any kind of product remediation. The law prohibited, if you failed to test for microbials, heavy metals, pesticides, that by law you weren't supposed to be able to sell that product at all. That's ludicrous, and I think we all understand that that's not how the industry operates in any other state. So one of our priorities over the last year and a half has been to influence remediation and to have it authorized, especially at the rule level, but it was also included in our legislative proposals this last year. So remediation is now going to be allowed. It's pretty extensive for the process. Again, check out the rules, see how this operates. There's a couple of issues with it that we've been discussing at the advisory board. One of those specifically on what can be remediated or not. And because their legal division believes that remediation is only allowed for microbials, you're not actually going to be able to remediate for pesticides or heavy metals right now, which I think anyone that does extraction knows that's pretty easy to actually do. But the agency doesn't really understand that. And they also think that they're handcuffed by statute. So one of their legislative proposals for this coming legislative session starting in January is to change that definition issue on remediation to allow for the pesticides and to allow for heavy metals to be remediated as well. But for right now, it's going to be restricted to microbials. Yes, sir.
Got a question over here?
Yeah.
Hey, I'm curious about California, for instance, has a testing threshold for pesticides, which is one for smokables, separate one for edibles. So, which makes a lot of sense because a lot of these pesticides are used on apples and oranges and everything else. So there should be a different threshold for edibles. So I'd like to see us make some progress in that direction.
Well, thank you. The comment, for those of you that couldn't hear, was talking about California's testing standards and how their pesticide restrictions are applied separately or uniquely for edibles versus, say, just flour, which is good because oftentimes that flour may get directly from the pesticide, but also when you do your extraction processes, sometimes it can intensify the collection of pesticides and make it in a more concentrated state. So it's good to have at both levels, but the new rules, actually we've set, I think, more reasonable standards for most of the testing requirements. They're not near as regimented or restrictive as either Colorado or California, However, there's a lot of direct product testing. If you look at, there's an appendices that's attached to the rules, and it says which products have to be tested for which contaminants. So we're getting in that direction.
Okay, perfect.
Yep. So again, one of the things that we really duked it out on over these proposed emergency rules that are being submitted to the governor, was they were proposing that we have a complete list on every product of quote unquote ingredients and chemical additives and pesticides. We don't have an actual listing of pesticides in Oklahoma because there's no adopted formal recognition of which pesticides are allowable or not. By virtue of our Department of Agriculture, they just haven't adopted them yet. The federal government does not have a listing because they still consider cannabis to be illegal. So we have really no guidelines currently in place. So what would be considered a pesticide or not is pretty much anything. There was a term chemical additive that was included in there. And that's real tricky. What I said at the board meeting, like, look, you're talking about every single nutrient that I'm adding into my plant. And a lot of that's going to be a protected trade practice. I don't necessarily want to share what my blend is with everyone. Not everyone, people want to really keep that as their secret. That's how they make their specials. So with that, having to disclose every chemical additive, you would have to list that on every single label. And not only would you have to list it, say, on my jar of nubs, but Julie, if she made some carts from my product, would have to have that whole listing on her package as well. So for a little box like this, just that proposal right there would require basically a take-on receipt about this long. So we tried to explain this to them, and fortunately, the agency listened to our recommendation. They stepped back from wanting to make this requirement. They list all those issues. And so all we're going to see now from the listing portion on your labels is an ingredients list. And typically that ingredients list is really mainly for chemicals. Because beyond that, ingredients can be pretty much everything. So we were fortunate to be successful in that, having that removed. I spent a lot of time on that at the meeting. Yes, ma'am.
As far as those, the ingredients, can that be via a QR code?
So it is not officially in the rules right now that it could be. The question was, can it be a QR code for your ingredients list or your label? Right now, the answer is it still has to be on the label. We've been trying to get that changed since really August of 2018. Just recognizing this issue that the more stuff you put on that label, it's easier for consumers who want to have access to that information to just click it, look at it, put a URL on there where they can see all of the information. I encourage folks to have URLs set up that list all their product specifications, that talk about terpenes and what the terpenes do. That way people can be educated on it if they want that information. But it should not be required as part of it. Yes. Absolutely. The comment was about that you can have your lab results and everything on QR codes as opposed to the ingredients. And it's an incredibly valid point. I think we will get there. It's something we've been discussing for some time. I know that one of the comments that came from legal counsel for the health department on this issue was that portions of that label, especially related to food and ingredient requirements, that's a federal requirement. So we have to have it on there, and we cannot put that into the URL. However, a lot of this other information, you can put into URL. Now, they have not issued a formal opinion on this, but I think it's something that's going to be encouraged. Austin? No. So the question was, you don't have to list THC or terpenes. No, you still have to list terpene potency, THC potency. Yeah, you still have to. Yes. So the rules on this issue for label standards still require those basic things: your company name, your address, your OMA license, your THC potency, your terpene potency, the statement that this product or pregnant women should not take this product, And then the other statement that said this product has been tested for contaminants. That's been added, I believe. So you need to look at that for the labeling requirements. But there's a few basic labeling requirements. It's still just edibles. It's not on the growers because we're not required to. I think processors still are going to be required to do that. Yeah, it was before just edibles. Yes. Question is, or comment is about, it's beyond non-edible products. There's a section in the proposed rules that is for edibles and for non-edibles and extends the requirement for address to those non-edible products. So if you're doing parties, you have address on that. Yeah, right.
Okay, but does it have to be a physical address or can it be a PO box?
It'd be a box, which is fine. Yeah, so what the justification is for these labeling requirements is a lot of what they're proposing right now is to prepare for cases of recalls. So a product recall, they want to make sure that if the patient has an issue with the product, they know who to contact, how to report that product, et cetera. And it's direct transparency for the consumer to know who they need to talk to. So that's really the reason for this. Earlier, and I hate to jump back, but when we talk about proposed emergency rules, it has to be justified by a health and safety issue. And so the language that they've included in these emergency proposals, they justify by the need for product recalls and then some of the testing lab issues that we've seen. So that's the whole justification they're using for these emergency rules. Okay. If you're a grower, you're now going to have to add all the labeling requirements if you're selling to another grower, and then also when you're selling to a processor. So instead of bringing in a trash bag full of bud and setting it down at a processor's facility, you have to use a sealed container or something that is capable of being resealed, and it has to have all of your license information, the same contact information on there. You have to submit that to anyone that you're selling to, not just say a dispensary or end-use purchaser. That came from a lot of criticism directly coming from the industry about people coming in with trash bags and dropping off product old school. So, all right. There's also a proposal for storing, how you store marijuana products. Basically, you have to have it in a sealed container. So at your facility, when you're doing your harvest, you start burping your product, everything has to be kept from that point on in a sealable container. Largely so there's no contamination issues. So once it's gone through curing, et cetera, it just has to be able to be sealed. And that seems like a pretty common sense proposal. Now, there were some issues that we had that I actually got pretty fired up about. I'm going to consult my notes real quick. We had this meeting on Monday and in the middle of harvest as well at the same time. So what happened on Monday is not so fresh in my memory now. So on the emergency rules, the mandatory ingredients, nutrients, chemical additives, we're going to pull that out. The field log on non-waste plant parts was the other one of the other most important parts. And then requirements for pesticide and chemical additives to be listed. Getting that taken off was one of the best parts as well. The rest of them are fairly benign, to be honest with you. The permanent rules, okay, so guys, these emergency rules, they're being submitted to the governor on, supposed to be tomorrow. We'll see if maybe it might be next week. And then the governor will probably take a week or so to sign off on those. Those rules will have almost an immediate impact. So you want to check those out and see how they're going to impact. Now we're going to shift over to the proposed permanent rules real quick. Lots of this has to do with penalties, fines, and fees. They've developed an entire appendix that lists what their proposed fees and fines are for all types of activities. It basically expands the authority of the agency to crack down on anyone who has any violations. One of the things I'm probably most concerned about here is the inclusion of language. It's pretty typical that you're going to have an agency where they set their fees and say $500 for misfiling or $500 for not allowing an inspector to come into your facility. But now it all says per occasion. So, or per occurrence, excuse me. So what that means is that if you submitted a report and it had 4 or 5 errors in it, well, they can hit you instead of 500. You're not talking about 2,000 or 2,500. They're going to hit you every time with it. It's a real slippery slope here, but that's included in this entire appendix of fees. And if anyone here has ever dealt with the health department before, they're good. They're a solid agency. They do the best work they possibly can, but they can be pretty brutal when it comes to the administrative process. So, you know, we've got some issues here that if anyone's, make sure you're dotting your I's and you're crossing your T's, okay? Because you want to make sure that you're doing it right and everyone's working together on this. So, so what we're seeing in these permanent rule proposals is requiring trade name registrations and submissions of certificate of trade names from the Secretary of State. If you're doing business and your LLC that's licensed is 123 ABC Limited, but you're actually doing all of your business in public as Cannabest Brands or whatever it might be, then you should have a doing business as registration with the Secretary of State's office, or trade name, thank you. So submit your trade name. You can get online and do this at the Secretary of State's website. It's fairly simple, but now you'll have to actually submit that registration and proof of registration with the licensing process. This is just intended so everyone knows who actually is doing business on these products. If anyone needs assistance with that, we can put a link on our websites to the Secretary of State's spot. Yes, Brian?
It costs $25 to register a trade name.
Yes.
To a already existing entity.
Costs $25 to register a trade name to an existing entity. You do that every single year as well. But this is just something you probably should do if you're not doing it already, and have that information, you know, so you're securing your actual business. Yeah, I mean, yeah, the comment is that unlimited, the number that you can register. Yeah, you can register as many different trade names that aren't conflicting with another name through the Secretary of State's website. So if you wanted to, yeah, throw out some bad examples there. Okay, so here's another big issue that we've seen in the food industry pretty extensively. There's been an extensive use of the terms organics and pesticide-free in this industry. There's been concerns about this in the food industry for years, that people will label something and say, oh, this is organic toast. But there's no process for that. They're not certified organic. They're just greenwashing using that terminology, saying, yeah, man, we're organic. Well, that devalues that process, that devalues the product, and it really hurts the ability for consumers to know what is legitimately pesticide-free and what is legitimately organic. So there's several proposals as far as how you do labeling, what is considered organic or not. And right now, there is no definition for organic because the USDA certified organic program does not apply to cannabis. We haven't adopted what are called the Organic Materials Research Institute OMRI standards, so we haven't developed those yet here. So there really is no organic certification, but if you are using products or you're selling products that claim to be organic or pesticide-free, you need to let them know that that's no longer allowed. They can't have that included in their process, or excuse me, included on their materials. Does anyone have any questions about that?
So OMMA has banned the use of the word organic.
Yes, without some sort of certification. And right now, there is no real certification for that. Yeah, so Austin makes the point, the comment where you say pesticide-free, shouldn't your test results just account for that? Because pesticides are not authorized right now. You cannot test positive for pesticides at all on your product. So with that being the case, if you have a passed test, then you should be pesticide-free. But it's not the same thing, because you can use organic insecticides, for example, and organic pesticides that are authorized that won't show up in your test, but are still pesticides. Exactly.
It's like selling bottled water labeled GMO free.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For those in the audience, like selling GMO water saying, or excuse me, selling bottled water saying it's GMO free. Okay, there's a specific clarification on sales and licenses. So everyone should know that you cannot sell a cannabis company outright. It is impermissible by statute and by regulations to have 100% change of ownership in one sale. You can do a series of transactions. You can have, say, for example, 75% of your ownership is sold. But you still have to have some of the original owners as part of that entity. And you can, up until this point, you could only do it one time a year. And we've had good clarification that if you're going for license renewal, you've had a change of ownership happen at that point, then you can actually update that during your renewal process. And then you also have the opportunity to do a change of ownership one more time during that year. So instead of being restricted to once, you can just do it through your license renewal process. It's not a big issue. It still, yeah, it has to be less than 100%. Because 1% would be fine. So, yes, sir. First comment.
Thank you. They will approve a 99% change of ownership of your entity, and then you just wait a couple months and you file for the 1% yourself. It's goofy. Oh, sorry, I was just saying it's a goofy procedure. They can sit that. Trying to be careful about how I say this. So, if you have an LLC, you don't own the license. You own an interest in the LLC that owns the license. What OMA has decided is that if you sell your LLC, that's a sale of license, a change of ownership, but it's not. The LLC is still owns the license. The ownership of the LLC is different. So what we've done as attorneys, I guess, is said, well, what about 99%? And they're like, well, okay, that's fine. And then we file a change of ownership for the 1% going in a couple months to the person who bought it, and then you end up with 100% change of ownership. Yeah, and it's still compliant, and it's the goofiest procedure on the planet. So,
what if the question was on ownership structure? If it's an LLC or if it's an incorporated entity, if it's a not-for-profit, whatever you're licensed as, that same thing applies. That you can do a change of ownership and do 99% of it, and then do your secondary change for the 1% later. So, again, holes that you can drive the truck through. Yes.
So I have a question. So what if you decide to open a business in the cannabis industry? You've got company X partnered with company B, and they decide to run this company as, A, being named A, right? So what company owns the license? Is it going to be company A that?
So the question is, when you have multiple companies that participate in ownership of the licensed entity, and so how you typically do this is.
So when you apply for my question, I'm sorry. When you apply for the license, do you apply for it under company A, or is it going to be two companies?
Question is, when you have multiple corporate entities or business entities that are listed as owners in a licensed business, you're submitting for your license, you're doing your application. How that typically works, it's going to be company A, that's the licensee, and then you have to list every individual that has an ownership interest in the other companies that are participating in that licensed entity. And then you have to list the name of that licensed entity and its ownership breakdown. So you basically do the same thing twice for whatever corporate entities might own the licensed entity. And that's basically a truth and ownership requirements, so they can trace it, shell corporations,
So
etc.
you have to, show your contracts.
Yes, yes. That comment was you have to submit your contracts, your operating agreements, your ownership documents, your corporate documents, your application process. One of the things that was a really hot topic that we worked on about a year and a half ago during these advisory board meetings was a requirement that is currently in rules, which prohibits the use of alcohol or smoking of marijuana or vaping on a licensed premises. Now, why is this a big issue? This is a big issue because any of you that have a commercial cannabis license right now, your licensed premises is actually the property on which your business sits. Now, in the case of a farm, this is also an issue when it comes to having minors, people under the age of 18 at these facilities, is that you got your kids there. Well, by law, or technically by the regulations, you can't have your kids there. You can't drink alcohol. You can't use cannabis. Excuse me, you can't smoke or vape cannabis. You can still take your gummies or however else you want to ingest it. But so this was a big issue that we really tried to go through with the advisory board, with the agency quite some time ago. And at the time, I was advised, or the board was advised by legal counsel, that statute prohibited them from changing this because I just saw this as a huge issue. This would be an opportunity that really, fortunately, we've had an agency thus far that's really been pretty good to work with, been pretty reasonable, I think, for the most part. But if you had a change in administration and all of a sudden you're dealing with a bunch of folks that aren't supportive and they got a bee in the bonnet for you and found out that you had a couple of bottles of liquor at your facility, that would be justification for having your license suspended or terminated. And that is a huge issue. I live on my farm. I was drinking beers last night. So, but, we're being told by council and staff over there at the OMA that this isn't something that actually go enforce or investigate. The real issue here, and there's proposals in the language right now that would extend that prohibition on alcohol or cannabis consumption to the property abutting that, like the parking lots. And the justification that they're seeking, or that they're trying to use for this, is that, say, dispensaries, you're having a party out in the parking lots, people are drinking beer, people are they're ingesting, they're smoking cannabis out there. It's very clear that you're not supposed to use products at, say, like a dispensary. It's very clear. It's in statute and it's in the regulations. But this would extend that to, say, parking lots. And at the advisory board, what we recommended unanimously was that the language actually be modified. And you can keep the prohibition on alcohol use, because for me, that makes sense. If you're in your laboratory and you're doing extraction equipment, yeah, you probably don't want people throwing like a 40 in there. You don't want someone smoking a joint. That's a big issue. So we proposed language that will just say, basically, you cannot use alcohol or smoke or vape cannabis in the areas of the licensed premises used for production. And that way, it's specific to it, because we're just waiting on something bad to happen, or this is enforced the way it probably shouldn't be. And fortunately, we've had an agency that hasn't done that. But I'm one of those guys that looks down the road, and all the attorneys in the room salivate thinking about this. Chris Connor.
And if I step on your toe here, I apologize. But if you have a grow or processing facility that's a farm or a residence of some sort that has acreage on it that you put your building on, I pray to God that you have gotten a lot split and separated out your homestead from the acreage that you're growing or doing the processing on. Because it fixes this issue, but B, it maintains your homestead protection. There's not a lot of benefits sometimes in living in Oklahoma, but that's one of them. Is that, you could get a judgment against you for a gajillion dollars. They could file a judgment lien and never foreclose on it because of the homestead exemption. But if you screw up your homestead and somehow it gets rolled up into some sort of situation, then your house is gone. So you can fix that problem of consumption, but more than anything else, I hope that you've done a lot split. So.
Chris Connor Law Firm in Bethany, Oklahoma. Giving free legal advice tonight. I love it. Thank you. And that is sound advice. I hope everyone will follow. So the question is, what's the definition of consuming alcohol? Is it difference between food grade alcohol versus, say, intoxicating beverages? I'm not sure they actually included a reference to the definition on that. I never looked. I think we assume it's intoxicating beverages. Sure. That's a very valid point. Point was about food grade alcohol can get you intoxicated as well, so could be a full-blown expansion of that definition, but again, I'd have to look at that. There is not a current definition for what alcohol is in reference to. That's what keeping it in Everclear bottle says. Okay, so two more things, then I'm gonna wrap up with this. One, there's two clarifications on what is prohibited activity. And so for those of you who may not have understood this correctly, in the statute, it says a grower can only sell to another grower, a dispensary, or a processor, and they can only buy from another grower. So historically, I think everyone knows how split arrangements used to work, that you would provide your biomass product to a processor, and typically they would do a split arrangement with you and return part of that processed item to you as the grower. Well, you can do that if you have a processing license. They can sell it back to your processing company, and your processing company can distribute it. But the way the statute was clearly written, and then now they're clarifying in the rules, is that you cannot do that. You can only basically, if you sell your product or transfer it to a processor to process and develop the material out of, that processor is either going to have to sell it for you, or you're going to have a processing license for it to come back. Does anyone have any questions on that? Yeah, that's how it was. They're just really specifying and clarifying it. So that was one of the issues right there. The second one is that no delivery. So I think we all know that no delivery was allowed. I think there's been some outfits that have tried to find a way around it. OMMA is trying to strictly clarify that no delivery is allowed from dispensaries. So that's all there. One last change in the proposed permanent rules. Any processors here might want to take note. They're setting forth the program requirements for how patient processing works. So if you're accepting product on behalf of a patient to process and return to them, they now have a proposed developed rules on how they're going to handle that. That had not been in place thus far. So on that note, I'm going to open the floor up. Do we have any questions, comments, concerns? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I heard two different answers, specifically from the OMMA, but can labs test for an individual? So an individual says, you know what, I bought this, I'm not sure if the lab results are accurate. You test it and tell me what you think. If we give a discount, we give them a discount because they're just a patient. You know, they don't actually know or
Yes.
license of anything else. So
The question for those of you at home is, can a patient submit to a testing laboratory product for testing? I don't have a direct answer to that. I think the answer is yes, because they are authorized to accept and hold that product. They have to document it. But I don't see anything in the rules that would prohibit that from occurring. Do any of my other fellow counselors over here have anything to say on that? Yeah. Yeah, I don't think there is a reason why you cannot do that. Yes.
Sorry, we've got one of our board members online wanting to know if we can clarify the changes to transportation and and does the transportation license, do you get an initial transportation license with your original license still, or has that changed?
Okay, so the question being, do you receive a transportation license with your commercial license? Well, by statute, yes, you receive a transportation license. However, that transportation license really doesn't mean anything now, because anyone who transports product for that company must have the transportation agent license. Now, at our advisory board meeting, I specifically requested that we change these rules to allow for basically a licensee, because, hey, we're getting this transportation license that was in the state question that the citizens of Oklahoma voted on. But right now, it doesn't do anything. So we propose that we change the rules to allow for at least one transportation agent registration per company. So you have that license itself. In the very term itself, transportation agent would mean someone carrying on behalf of you, not you, the licensee. So it really doesn't make much sense. Yes. Well, there could be one for, so comment was there should be one for every person of interest, and that's definitely the most liberal approach to it. I think we'd be lucky to get one per company, and that's definitely what we're shooting for, but we should get one for every person of interest. Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, ma'am. That's right. That's in the proposed rules right now. No, right now you have to do the transportation agent license. We are making the request that they change the rules to authorize each entity to have at least one automatic agent license. Now, there was some pretty heated discussion about how transportation agent is defined, and in these proposed rules, they're wanting to restrict that anytime you're transporting product, every person in that vehicle must have a transportation agent license. So that's a pretty big change. So I hope everyone heard that. The proposal that every person in a vehicle transporting product would have to have a transportation agent license. So no more running errands with wife and dropping off product at stores on the way. You're going to have some folks that, only people with an agent license, or the wife is getting an agent license, which I encourage anyways, actually. Any other comments? Julie, you have anything? Yeah. You feel like, have I covered it?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, ma'am. The comment was, if the product was in a trailer, separate part of the vehicle, would that be okay to have a non-licensed person in the vehicle? I'm not sure, because there hasn't been any guidance on this yet. I think it might still be considered, you're transporting that product, so whoever's on that vehicle is in the vehicle. Caleb?
Do we foresee any future license or special provisions for sales to be allowed at special cannabis events or concerts?
So comments about, do we foresee any kind of licenses or authorization for cannabis to be used at concerts or third-party events? That was actually a topic of discussion at this week's advisory board meeting when we were discussing the whole restriction on alcohol or cannabis use on licensed premises. There was a discussion of having a approval process, or at least a notification process, for having consumption events that might be at or near a licensed facility. But there is no formal action on this right now. There's no proposals. But say, for example, here in the city of Oklahoma City, if you want to have a special event where you're serving alcohol, you typically have to pull a permit with the city of Oklahoma City. You go through a process, you submit your plan for review, what kind of food trucks are going to be there, you tell them all this good stuff, and they give you a special event permit. I would not be surprised if we move in that direction and if we end up with a special event permit for these issues. Now, the reason that this is being discussed is because, well, let's just admit, I mean, there's people having all sorts of events all over the place where, they've got consumption events in the parking lots and bands, and I think that worries folks, especially at the regulatory agency and definitely law enforcement. So that's one of the reasons why they're talking about it. My only comment to everyone would be, if you're going to do an event like that, I would highly recommend reaching out to either your municipal planning department or the OMA and just saying, hey, we're going to do this event. Is this cool? Because if not, I don't really want them to show up there and shut you down. So, Caleb?
Is there still a resident requirement on the transportation agent license?
The residency requirement is no longer in place because of the permanent rules. That was changed. So let's see, transportation agent, I think laboratory, research facility, and education facility research, education, and transportation agent were all exempted from the definition of commercial licensee, so they are not required to have that 2-year residency.
As of this week, they're still rejecting.
Yeah, they rejected people that work for me.
Comment was, as of this week, it's still being rejected. I've had several rejected myself, so they're probably still ironing out the wrinkles.
So do we resubmit it, or?
Yes.
Because you only have 30 days, and just with the same thing, or you attach another document, or?
Well,
Yeah, just
the advice on that's always going to be to provide as much documentation as possible,
Okay.
especially if they're still rejecting it, to go ahead and provide that. Kaylin, another one from online.
Yep. Is there any discussion happening about being able to have a marijuana cafe or lounge?
Is there discussion about having marijuana cafe or lounge? Short answer, no. I mean, that's not going to be allowed anytime soon. Has there been discussion on it? Sure. But yeah, no, that's not happening. There's really no movement to allow third-party use at specific facilities. And I think now that we have in House Bill 2612 from the 2019 legislative session, they added changes and put cannabis under the Oklahoma Smoking in Public Places Act. So it really restricts where you can actually smoke or vape cannabis. And that would specifically apply to, say, a lounge or a restaurant, especially if it was open to the public. Now, there might be some ways to get around that. However, no one's done it yet. So I personally don't see it happening anytime soon. Yes, sir. Yes. I'm sorry, say it again. So the question is that the 25-year-old requirement for a transportation agent, there is no proposal for that to change right now in the permanent rules. I know there's an 18-year-old limitation for working for a licensed business, but I've seen no proposals to change that. Yes, sir.
So we do, I think this happens, one of our services that you said earlier, we make it available. The OMA contract guide doesn't have to a lot of. We internally made a guide for in-house hires. Anybody's interested in that, I don't have to.
What's your name of the company?
Seaward Strategy.
Okay.
And I can skip your email or give you a card. But we've got a lot of frustration with clients that we literally have to. And so we kind of have this resource in-house with some private
So comment for those watching at home and who may not have heard our guest here, Seaworthy Strategies, thank you.
Hey, new member as of yesterday.
New member, ladies and gentlemen, Seaworthy. So if anyone has the need for really some label and packaging consultation, he's basically willing to give you some easy resources, especially for FDA requirements, USDA requirements. There's a lot of federal packaging requirements from the Code of Federal Regulations that aren't spelled out in the OMA rules. And so you have to reference those to make sure you're covering everything that's required. Again, it is.
And a lot of times get me into the rabbit hole and it says 53.
And his comments really on the real lack of clarity that we've received from the agency over the last 2 years when it comes to specific questions like the clarity panels, opaque, what the packaging requirements are, and that the packaging guidelines that are included on the LMMA website are not comprehensive. So he's offering to assist with that if you need anything. If you're willing to, we put something through our website as well. Excellent. Thank you. We appreciate that. Kaylin?
Are pre-rolls still allowed under grow licenses?
Are pre-rolls still allowed under grow licenses? Currently, yes. As of right now, there is no statutory restriction and there's no regulatory restriction.
All right, that's the last question from online.
Okay, does anyone else in the audience tonight have any questions? Well, I know that was a consolidated overview of some pretty serious rulemaking. I just squeezed several months of work into an hour and a half or so. But there's a lot more to it. I highly encourage you to read through these documents. If nothing else, we emailed you a summary of the rule changes and a summary of the proposed changes. Check those out. Those are 2 to 3 pages apiece, and it highlights each provision. So you want to at least look at that to see if there's more in-depth information that you need to look to. So if no one else has any questions here, so I think I have a couple of announcements that are going to be made. But we really appreciate everybody coming out tonight. We've got a lot of new members here. This is how we build our industry. It's how we do strong advocacy for really the fastest growing and one of the strongest cannabis industries in the country. It's pretty staggering, the numbers that we're seeing, the amount of licensees, the economic impact. But having all you folks come in, getting new faces in the room, it's really inspiring, and this is how we make our presence felt with our policymakers and with the community at large. We are now doing committee meetings on the first Thursday of every month. Here at this facility, starting at 6 p.m., we have a growers committee, a processors committee, testing laboratory, and dispensary. Now, we just had our processing committee.
So the grower committee's already formed, but we just chaired our processor committee.
Yes, our processing committee has a chair from Cartel Parts that will be there, hopefully running that meeting. And then our growers committee has a chair and co-chair as well. Testing laboratory committee is being chaired by James Vandersea with Cannabis Laboratories. But we could use a volunteer coming from the dispensary arena who wants to serve as the dispensary committee chair. And why are these committees important? Because this is the opportunity for folks to talk directly with the people that are in their field about some of the issues they're facing. It's an opportunity to bring in presenters specific to them, so nutrient companies, lighting companies, etc. But it's also a place where policy recommendations should be coming up from the committees to our board of directors to pursue with the legislature. So that's effectively where we've got our dancers here. Ladies and gentlemen, the burlesque dancers. Yeah, that's much better than me up here. But I highly encourage everyone to stick around, network with everybody. This is really the opportunity to get together, swap information, make some sales, make some trades. Does anyone have any announcements? Blake Cantrell from Peak is going to come up and talk about something. But I just want to encourage, if you are wanting to serve on these committees, we need a dispensary chair. And again, this is your opportunity to discuss what's most important to you, whether it's growing practices or policy recommendations. And that's how it's going to come up to the board of directors, which kind of guides our organization. So we need everyone to get as engaged as possible. Like,
chair the committee, and then that committee will bring advice to the board.
Let's go, everybody. Okay, so I'll be brief, and I'm going to give you some free shit, so bear with me. I'm genuinely just seeking feedback from people in the industry who are professionals in doing this. We are considering this product, but I'm not sold on whether it's legit or not, so I'm seeking feedback. So this product basically is called Undo, and it is supposed to reset somebody's THC tolerance or clear their head whenever they are currently high. And like, you know, if your kid's school calls and you didn't expect to have to do anything and you need to get sobered up real quick, evidently, and okay, so granted my science background, like God's honest truth, my science classes in college were for my non-lab, Age of Dinosaurs, and for my lab, rocks. So this is all secondhand. I was a business major. I went at that too, and those were bad. So basically, I have included in these little bundles 2 packages. The science, evidently, according to people that know better than me, checks out. So the molecule of this, and again, my background, Olivitol supposedly is molecularly similar to THC. So if you are currently high, this chemical binds with your CB1 and CB2 receptors and replaces THC and then prevents additional THC from binding. What we did is we
distributed out about 10 of these to our management team. About 8 of them said that they thought it was legit. But before we jump in with both feet, I really would like your feedback. Like, does it work? Yeah.
I've got lots of feedback, so.
Oh, you've tried it? Okay, great.
Yes, and I had lots of patients try it. So, I was notified of the product about a year and a half ago. I had patients try it. To really reset your tolerance, which is another point for that, you have to take 4 capsules.
There are 4 in each of the little deals that I found up right.
So Dr. Dustin Sulak, I don't know, some of you might be familiar, he and I talked about it, and he says that there's no adverse risk associated with that product, so it's like, why not?
Are you claiming that it actually resets your
Again,
tolerance?
I am not claiming anything, except that I took the rocks.
No claims have been made.
Studies show patients have indicated that it's helped them reset their tolerance. Now, for me personally, yes, it did help me reset my tolerance. But here's the deal: it's an oral capsule that goes into your gut, and it takes forever to start working.
30 to 45 minutes.
If you have somebody who's really panicking and needs something, we need a water-soluble version of that. And
So
that's
this
my big
is the product. What they had told us was that it is very important to drink a full glass of water with it. It's on like a little literature thing, but I believe that's what
Yeah,
we're referring to.
yeah. So get them to make a spray, and I'll love it even more. But
Yeah.
I think it works.
Drops or spray is what she's
I'm
saying.
giving away the capsules I've got. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. But no. I'm legit like wanting to know if this is bullshit or not. And what better than professional stoners to answer that question?
Right, you're just wanting
All right.
to figure it
Yeah.
out.
So like we stapled like
I got a 5.
exactly like I'm giving them to you all. I felt like I felt something, but I only tried it once, and I don't know that it wasn't placebo. So I'm genuinely curious whether you all think it's legit or not before we jump in with both feet and try to sell it to the public. On the back, we just stapled so that there's a general contact info at the bottom is the email. Even if it's just the subject line, it's bullshit with no content, that's fine. Like we want to know if this is something that is worth our time or not. And internally, we believe that it is, but that was a pretty small sample set. So what better way? So y'all don't have to dig into this bag. I'm just going to dump them at the front of the stage here. Please just take one. There's 4 pills, 2 packets. If you're doing it for a tolerance reset, their recommendation was to take all 4. What we did internally was we gave 2 pre-rolls of the same flour to our managers, had them try one. It was a couple different, either smoke both and take this and see if it sobers you up, or smoke one the day before, take it in the evening, smoke the other of the same flour, same circumstances, what have you. Smoke that next one and see if you felt a noticeable difference in your tolerance. So that's just how we did it. But if you're going to take one, you're more than welcome to, but please give me feedback because I'm genuinely curious whether this is for real or not. Everything to the contrary, or everything that I've collected seems that it is. But again, before we jump in, I'm really curious. And if this is legit, like that is a really cool thing.
Yeah.
Like what person wouldn't
Narcon for stoners, man.
Exactly. Like any person who uses cannabis and has children would want this. So like it has real value and utility, but I'm just not 100% sure yet. So I appreciate your feedback. Again, this is like a flyer they gave us, and we just stapled something that doesn't have my personal email address on it. And if you would just shoot an email to us, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you all.
Thank you, Blake.